I must have sat there in the shadows nearly half an hour trying to understand by what possible means the Maori Tohunga had passed from beneath that lake to the higher part of the cave. I was tolerably sure that the water which now thundered down into the lake was the deflected current of that which had formerly welled up from below, no more no less in bulk, for the overflow into the abyss was neither increased nor diminished by the change. Moreover, having witnessed Ngaraki's maneuver with the long lever above the abyss, I felt convinced that he had performed the same feat with a similar lever under the lake, and I was strengthened in this conviction by the fact that the dark thing which had reared its head above the water, where it still remained at the back of the cascade, was obviously the end of some rock which might serve that purpose. The sunlight all this time had been slowly descending as the sun had risen. Now its upper margin had disappeared over the margin of the lake, and all above was getting dark again. No longer fearful of being seen in the dim light, I crept round towards the cascade to inspect the part of the rock which had appeared above the water. It was smooth and rounded, and covered with black slime, appearing to be a portion of a spar with hewn characteristics like the others. I was seized with a wish to bring weight to bear upon this strange contrivance, and see if it was balanced in any way. Accordingly I passed through the battery of spray behind the cascade and secured the longest piece of remo I could find in the recess. Returning with this, I leaned forward over the margin and gave a strong, steady push to the rock, but failed to move it. It seemed as firm as the main rock on which I stood. Evidently the raising of this lever opened a way for the water to come down from above, and removed the pressure from some aperture below the lake, thus leaving it free for the initiated to pass through. When I attempted to review my position, I came to the conclusion that until the water was shut off again by the great horizontal spar, I was a prisoner in the cavern, unless I liked to take that plunge through the opening in the side of the mountain. I went round the margin of the lake and looked at it. The water was everywhere within 6 inches of the continuous pathway of rock. It meant a dive of nearly 20 feet before striking the current, and then there was no end of skill required to avoid being bruised against the rocks in passing through. I resolved not to try it, not just yet at all events. I had yet to explore the cavern round the buttress and along the narrowing gulf that led to the huge grating, so I determined to spend the remaining time of my detention in discovering if possible what the lower parts of the temple contained. With great care I retraced my steps behind the cascade and round the lake until I regained the darker shadows of the buttress. I made my way onto the broad ledge, above which hung the wooden sprit of the spar, and here, as I stood and gazed down into the abyss, I noticed something which made my flesh creep. It was a simple thing perhaps, but it touched me more nearly than anything I had as yet encountered in that gloomy place. There, on the wall of the abyss, some hundreds of feet below the basin, below the great spar hanging in space, I could see all that was now left of the sunlight, a bright red patch glistening upon the granite. Making my way a little further along to the angle of the buttress, I could trace the shaft of light from the abysmal depths up to the stupendous grating at the far end of the gulf. It was the most glorious, and at the same time the most awe-inspiring thing I have ever seen, this ray from the outer world cutting through the darkness like a golden bar, and falling, all red, upon the sheer wall far away below. It pointed to a depth at which my brain reeled, but the dark which lay above it and the dark which stretched below suggested a depth beyond the depth which was positively awful to contemplate. I sat down upon the rocky lip of that vast mouth of Porawa and gazed stupidly at this clear channel of golden light running through the solid dark. The patch upon the wall far down crept lower and lower, but found no floor. Was the place indeed bottomless then? As I asked myself this question, the light faded away and all was gloom again, save for a dull daylight that crept in for a little distance through the giant's window. A cloud had come before the sun. Now again the ray came in like the thrust of a golden spear, then it was withdrawn, and, though I waited for some time, it did not reappear. With a great weight of awe and darkness upon me, I rose from the rock resolved to reach the grating at the end of the gulf and there restore myself with the ungarnished daylight. It was not, however, without some recollection of what old Te Makawawa had said about the vile tohungas of the pit that I felt my way along the narrow ledge, which seemed to have been hewn with design as an approach to the grating. I felt I was going the right way to be cooked and eaten by these same vile tohungas, wherever they might be in the darkness, but, although naturally of a nervous disposition, I was always careless whether I ran into unknown dangers with the right foot first or the left, so I continued my way, holding on to the jagged points of the wall with my right hand, while choosing every footstep with the utmost care, for I was hardly the fool to risk a fall into the abyss, and look for its ground floor. Head first without a light. It took me nearly half an hour to travel the 200 yards, but once within 50 paces of the huge grating I could see more distinctly. Soon I reached a spot beneath those tremendous bars, and, looking up at them against the clouded sky without, saw clearly that they must have been fashioned by the hand of man at some remote period of the world's history, concerning which our bravest anthropologists are reticent, or speak only in whispers. Haeckel could show no photographs of his speechless men of Lemuria, and many would have laughed him down. Yet, if Haeckel had been with me on that never-to-be-forgotten day when I explored that colossal place, he would have wept for joy over those mighty stone bars, obviously hewn by the hand of man out of the everlasting granite. There were 4 of them, each fully 30 feet high. In places the action of air and moisture had worn them very thin, and, as I seated myself on a broad ledge that reminded me of a windowsill, I heard the rising wind making strange, weird chords as it swept these vibrating bars like the strings of a gigantic harp. The music of the wind playing through the bars of the giant's window reminded me of that ghostly hum of a phantom race which I had heard in my dream. It rose and died away like a voice from the distant past, calling up that peculiar feeling of long, long ago, until in my own civilized way I became a veritable tiki, and admitted that the ancient temple was haunted by the wailing spirits of the giant sorcerers of old. The men who had bound that great spar down with that huge round stone, what else could have done it? The men who had made the secret way by which Ngaraki had disappeared beneath the lake, who had carved the pathway out of the side of the abyss and fashioned this stupendous window, the men of old who had done all this still haunted that profound darkness down there, in which, perhaps, there were mysteries of a stranger kind. Perhaps. Certainly, at least, there was a pathway leading down into the darkness on the opposite side to the one by which I had come. I could see that plainly. At length I roused myself from my reverie, and passing through the stone bars, stood on a jagged platform without. Below was a great fissure, and, facing me about 40 yards beyond, was the rock which formed the further boundary of this fissure. Its crest was just above the horizon of the outer world. The depth of the fissure I could not see, but it stretched some distance away to the left, or its expansion was hidden by a bend in its course. On the left of the rock on which I stood was nothing but a small crag, and beyond that the mountain wall, but on the right was a rugged pathway, shelving fearfully, but still a pathway, leading round the head of the fissure to the other side. I determined to see what came of this, and taking off my boots to get a better foothold on the shelving rock, I followed it. I never fully realized what a coward I was until I got to the other side and found the cold perspiration rolling off my face. It was a blind pathway, at least it seemed so, for it came to a sudden halt, as if the prehistoric workman had given it up. I went down on my chest and looked over, but saw nothing but the gloomy bottom of the gulf far below. I even took my little pocket mirror and held it so that I could see beneath the rock below, but could make out nothing except a ledge and a hole in the rock about 20 feet down. If it ever had been a secret way, it had long since been abandoned. No man could ascend from below, yet it was possible one might reach that hole by means of a rope. I retraced my steps and re-suffered my cold perspiration till I reached the stone bars again. A glance at my watch showed me it was now nearly 12 o'clock. I had nothing to eat, so dinner was out of the question. The next best thing was a smoke. There was no use in going back into the cavern, for I had explored everything there except the lake, and candidly I did not feel equal to exploring under water in the pitchy darkness, with a cataract overhead and an outlet into an abyss below. Accordingly, I sought out a little recess where the inner pathway joined the giant's windowsill, and there put on my boots, after which I lighted my pipe and smoked the smoke of the hungry. The faint roar of the cataract within the cavern fell upon my ears with a reassuring sound, for I knew that in all probability its cessation would mark the time when Ngaraki would come down from his unknown haunts above, perhaps to put up the spar again and leave the exit clear. The hours passed slowly, but there was no change. 6 o'clock came, but still the cataract roared on with a dull, muffled sound. Whether it was the monotonous murmur of the falling water, or the wailing music of the wind in the great stone bars, I do not know, but I fell into a sleep, from which I was awakened some time later by the full moon, which had just risen above the further boundary of the fissure, and was shining full upon me. Its pale, silver light flooded into the far interior of the cavern, and fell upon the crags of the buttress, the sides of the basin, part of the spar, and the lake beyond in the distance. As I looked at these things and collected my faculties, I suddenly realized that the roar of the cataract had stopped. The wind had fallen, it no longer moaned in the stone bars. All was as silent as the grave of things long dead. My first thought was to see if the passage out of the mountain was clear. Accordingly, I made my way along towards the buttress. Part of the pathway was in the moonlight, but when I reached it I found that the great spar was still hanging horizontal above the abyss, while the moon rays flooding onto the surface of the lake showed the water boiling up from below as when I had first seen it. For a long half-hour I crouched in the shadows there, thinking that the fierce Tohunga would again appear on the scene, but all was quiet, nothing moving except the overflow into the abyss, and the moonlight slowly creeping down after it. At the end of this half-hour a happy idea occurred to me. Perhaps the moonlight would serve me to explore the abyss by the descending pathway I had noticed on the other wall of the gulf. I retraced my steps and stood again by the giant's window. The moon was in a cloudless sky, and one of the slanting beams fell upon a part of the path some 10 yards down. Beyond that the way continued in darkness, but from a brief calculation I concluded that in less than an hour the moonlight would illumine the very depths of the abyss, and if I started at once on my hands and knees I might be able to keep up with it. It was hard work going down that rough road on all fours, but it was the easiest way in the long run, for a single false step in the darkness would have been fatal. There were no loose stones, but for the first 50 yards the way was very uneven, and, though not steep enough to reach the point where I had seen the patch of sunlight in the morning, sufficiently downhill to make my progress slow and laborious. From time to time I glanced at the moonlight, which streamed past me on the left, and fell on the perpendicular wall some 100 feet below the basin. I saw more clearly now that as the night wore on and the moon rose higher, its light would flood down into the profound depths of the pit. Already it revealed the outstanding arm of some crag projecting from the other side of the gulf. When I had proceeded nearly 100 yards along the descending way, I found that by the help of a granite crag which stood out from the wall, the path turned back upon itself. In this new direction it was less uneven, and, after traversing its length for some 50 yards, I discovered that it turned back upon itself again, leading down in the original direction. It was strange work, crawling along an unknown way in total darkness, and it was in vain that I endeavored to make light of it. But the moonlight reassured me somewhat. It was now far below, resting on the perpendicular granite, the bedrock of the world. But still it crept down and down. Where was the bottom of this fearful place? Higher and higher rose the moon into the sky, lower and lower her rays sank into the pit. The light was now striking down at an angle of 45 degrees to the horizontal, and as I scanned its whole length it seemed to me like a solid silver bar strong enough to bear one's weight from the giant's window away into the depths below. The path was now smooth and even, and I gained on the moonlight. When within 60 or 70 yards of its resting place I was surprised to find a blank precipice in front of me. At least, as I groped before me with my hands, I felt that the rock took a sudden descent. Thinking that this might be anything from a small precipice of 3 feet to a yawning gulf of 1,000 yards, I took a small stone and dropped it over the edge. It fell on solid rock 3 or 4 feet below. Scrambling down I found a level step, and, 2 paces further on, another break leading down again to another step. It was not until I had passed down over several of these that I came to the conclusion that it was a regular staircase on a vast scale. Each step as I stood on that below it reached nearly to my shoulder, and its breadth was quite 5 feet. Surely I was getting down into the region of the vile Tohungas, but I was not yet on a level with the moonlight. Another 10 or 12 steps brought me to a spot where, 30 yards in front of me, I saw the lower margin of the moonbeam strike upon the grey granite wall, which as yet gave no hint of where it might find a basement in the yawning gulf below. I sat down to wait, knowing that between 40 and 50 yards lower down the staircase must meet the wall and turn back again upon itself in order to continue the descent. Now that I had nothing to do but to await developments, I felt the silence and the darkness resting like crushing weights upon my senses. Not far away on the left I could hear the faint swish of the torrent from the lake as it fell through the darkness, but no sound came up from below to tell that it had found a bottom in that profundity beneath. With my physical eyes I could see little, but the scene as I viewed it in my mind's eye was one of stupendous grandeur. Behind, far above, was the moonlight flooding through the giant's window, and striking down through the dark until it fell upon the granite, glistening with a pale grey before me. High overhead I knew the long spar hung suspended, and below, shrouded in impenetrable gloom, was a world of unknown things hidden in the blackness of darkness forever. Into this gloom I peered and waited. The edge of the light cut the dark as sharp as a knife, leaving a surface like jet. By whatever agency, human, natural, or diabolic, this pit had been hewn out of the solid rock in the remote past, it seemed that on clear nights the moon must still hew it out again from the solid dark. Here then was the pit. Where were the vile Tohungas? I was aroused from my dreams of the giants in those days, the vile Tohungas who, according to Temakawawa, inhabited this lower part of the temple, by the moonlight impinging upon something standing up out of the darkness towards my left. I fixed my eyes upon the object, thinking it was the IMG 107.jpg. The light sank lower and showed more. Then to my astonished eyes was unveiled, inch by inch from the darkness, the massive granite brows of a gigantic head. Pinnacle of some outstanding crag. The light sank lower and showed more. Then to my astonished eyes was unveiled, inch by inch from the darkness, the massive granite brows of a gigantic head. Suddenly the light flashed back from two bright red eyeballs, which shone like petrified blood. The nose and mouth and chin then came into view, and at length the whole head and neck stood out clear above the gloom. The face of this image, which, if in due proportion, was evidently 30 feet high, was strong and terrible. The eyes looked up at the moon from beneath a receding brow, the nose was long and flat, and the lower lip of the firm, evil mouth was curled as if in disdain. It was a sinister face that thus greeted the queen of the night, sinister, proud, and contemptuous in its power. This was perhaps the lord of a fallen race, one of those mighty pre-Adamites who walked the earth of which ours is the wreck. Perchance, who knew, he might represent the mighty and terrible Nephilim spoken of in the book of Enoch. Such thoughts as these crowded through my brain as I watched. But this giant image was not alone. Slowly, and one by one, other heads appeared above the darkness, until I counted 11. Huge shoulders and chests now gleamed in the light of the moon. 11 pairs of red eyes flashed back her rays all bloodshot. The terrible images seemed to be worshipping the great luminary, but it was the worship of scorn, for each one looked up and curled his lips with a calm half-smile of masterly disdain. They were set in a semicircle, and I saw that originally there might have been 12, for there was a gap in the line where one was missing. Thinking that this one might be much smaller than the rest, I waited for the light to fall upon his head, but the gap remained a gap, and I concluded that one of these vile Tohungas of the pit had fallen from his place. By this time the moonlight fell full 30 feet below the head of the tallest statue, and showed that the images were merely busts, carved only to the waist, or in each case the hands were clasped over the abdomen. It showed also that the pedestals were each in one piece with the statue. At last the light reached the floor of the abyss, and the vile Tohungas stood out in bold relief, casting great shadows upon the granite wall behind. I saw their bases, and wondered to find that they were of a piece with the bedrock. They had been fashioned bodily out of the very plutonic ground floor of the earth. Vying with the moon herself in age, these figures had stood up from the floor of the abyss to greet her with that scornful sneer upon their faces for untold ages. My imagination traveled back through vast stretches of time until I was weary and spent. Suddenly a voice from the darkness to the left below startled me. A voice in that dread place. It sent the blood back on my heart as with crooked fingers I gripped the rock. In another instant, however, I recognized the chanting of Ngaraki, and remembered the mention Te Makawawa had made of cursing the vile ones of the pit at the full of the moon. By the alternations of his chanting with the strange silence of the place, I knew that he was passing up and down there in the darkness before the colossal figures. By the increasing vehemence of his wild song I knew also that he was working himself up into a fury of wrath. It was a chant more terrible and savage than that which I had heard on the bank of the pool outside the mountain, more wild and fierce than the hollow murmurs which had reached me from far above while smoking at my campfire. He may have been a savage then, but he was something more, or something less, now. His words, ringing high with growing rage, almost infernal in their intensity, struck a note of horror in my listening soul. Ha! Stand out, lurkers in the dark. Come out of your hiding places, come out and stand up in the light of the moon. Bold Taranaki cleaves the sky, I call his ancient fire to eat your bones, and Tongariro spits his rage aloft Enga. 'Twill fall and boil your heads in pitch. The earth was young, the moon scowled from the sky with laden breasts of poison milk, and he scowled up at her, vile sneering ones, and drank destruction to the world. The earth is old, your words are living still, I will make you eat your words Enga. I will make you eat the heads of the words you spoke to men. To what shall I place my cursing power? To your heads? They're fit for the feast of a chief. To what shall I place my cursing power? To your eyes? I will snatch and eat them raw. To what shall I place my cursing power? To your bones? Enga. Hooks for the shark god. To what shall I place my cursing power? To your cursing power? Yes, to your cursing power. Cursed in the light, writhe till the sun goes down, Enga. Cursed in the dark, writhe till the sun comes up, Enga. At this point I caught sight of the fierce Tohunga as he advanced each time into the line of light to within a few paces of the granite figures. His garments swayed about him as he rushed forward, his long hair was disheveled, and in his hand was a greenstone mirror, which glinted in the moonrays as he whirled it high above his head in the rising fury of his cursing. Constantly advancing into the light like an infuriated savage, and retreating again into the shadows with his chin upon his breast, like a man in profound thought, he chanted louder and more fiercely as his onward rushes became more terrible in gesture and his retreating movements more profound in their repose. Thus with hurricane and calm, he approached the climax when the hurricane should end in frenzy and the calm in trance. Where is the pot shall hold your heads? Where is the fire shall boil the pot? I'll spend my life in making it Enga. Beyond Kaikoura's rugged crest, beyond Raukawa's rolling tide, are pots of pitch that seethe and hiss, mountain pots that roar and rage, lakes of fire whose billows roll and dance and leap into the air. I hear them calling for your heads. But fiercer fires have louder tongues, a fire of raging hate is here, fed by deadly cursing Enga. Here! Vile lurkers! Here! He beat upon his breast to show them where the fire was hissing, and seething, and roaring for their heads. Ere Taranaki glowed with love for fair Pihanga's pure embrace, ere thundering Tongariro burned with angry thought to call her his, 17 This fire was made with ancient hands. Tawaki fanned it with his breath, his footsteps thunder in the sky I curse you with his mighty breath Enga. Now Taranaki's fires are low, he stands apart. His flame is fled, his voice is still, but mine will roar with countless tongues that shake the earth with Ruamako. Nor storm, nor sea, nor Rengi's tears can quench this raging fire of hate which leaps with curses at your throats Enga. The time will come. The time will come. Hinori sleeps aloft and waits low. She starts, she moves, she wakes. Now she takes the stranded spar and hurls it down into the pit. The crash is heard through all the earth. See. I snatch your heads in triumph, and place them in the mighty pot. Waka Ariki 18, your heads are mine to boil in everlasting pitch. Apakakawat Enga. Giving out the last few words in a voice of thunder that woke strange rumbling echoes far above, the Maori rushed forward more like a demon than a human being. I saw his strong face twisted with rage. I saw the mere gleam in the moonlight. Then with a final curse, a savage yell which seemed to shake the granite statues of the dead, he hurled the weapon at the head of the tallest image. Like a flash of green light it darted through the moon rays. It struck upon the forehead of the vile Tohunga, and sparks came forth. With a crashing sound it struck and then glanced off and fell upon the rock at my feet. I picked up the mirror and looked again at the image. The mark of the weapon showed clear and distinct above the left eyebrow. But the sudden silence was unearthly. What of Ngaraki? I looked below, where I had seen him halt in his last mad rush. He was lying prostrate on his face upon the granite floor, motionless. For some minutes I watched him, then, as he did not move, I climbed down the remaining steps, and, keeping out of the moonlight as much as possible, reached a point near to the prostrate figure. His hands were stretched out before him, with fingers bent as if clawing at the rock, and his head rested on one side, so that the moonlight showed the glassy stare of one of his wide-open eyes. I saw that he was either dead or in a trance, and, as the Tohunga Maori of the old regime was not unlike Balam, I concluded that Ngaraki had induced a trance in the regular way, and would now remain like one dead perhaps for hours. I lingered in the shadows watching him for some time, then my eyes wandered mechanically round the semicircle of figures that towered above. Surely I had made a mistake. Where was the gap left by the 12th Tohunga? Falling back a few paces I counted them again. Surely I had been deceived. There were 12 of them, and the one that now stood where the gap had been, raised his gigantic head above all the rest. His face was not like those of the other images. There were traces of nobility upon the brow, and the lips were more sad than disdainful. But what struck me most was the fact that it seemed less substantial than the others. Could it be a phantom of the imagination, a thing conjured up before a mind unbalanced by the awful bloom of the place, by hunger, and thirst, and fatigue? As I glanced again at the features of the face, now more distinct than before, I passed my hand over my forehead and felt it was wet. And well it might be, for the unsubstantial image that stood before me had features and an expression closely resembling, though in a gigantic way, those of Ngaraki himself. With an impulse that I could not restrain, I hurried across the open space, and, approaching the 12th Tohunga, put out my hand to touch it. My fingers closed on empty air, and lo! There was the gap again unoccupied as before. At that moment the prostrate figure of the Maori moved upon the ground, and I darted again into the darkness. Looking back I saw him get up and shake himself, then move away into the shadows, whence he presently reappeared with a piece of smoldering punk and a crooked stick of wood. With these he sat down, and blowing the punk into a blaze, ignited the wood, which, by its combustible qualities, I knew to be a piece of the heart of the Rimu. At length he held the torch high above his head and came towards me, but, as he passed by on one side of the figure near which I was standing, I crept round with the shadow on the other. Unconscious of my presence, he kept on his way until the light of his torch shone upon the body of water which fell through space with mysterious sighs, whipping the air and throwing off fine, floating spray as it went on its inexplicable course past the very foundations of the mountain, for I now saw that it disappeared in a circular opening in the ground floor, an abyss below the abyss. A few paces before the brink of this road to Porawa the Tohunga paused, and, holding his torch high, shed its light upon the face of another figure carved out of the granite, and standing apart with its back turned upon its fellows. Again the eerie feeling assailed me, for that rugged face gazing upwards through the dark was the face of the 12th Tohunga, having the same strange resemblance to the Maori himself. It was a noble countenance, and the contour of the lips expressed, not disdain like the others, but humility and sadness, perhaps repentance. Unlike the others, too, his hands were joined over his heart. Perchance this was one of the great ones who, as Tamakawawa had told us, had fallen from his high magic to consort with the vile to trick them, and, having completed his design, had turned his back upon their evil faces and set his image there apart to gaze up through the age-long night towards the distant point far above where the radiant Hinori stood and waited. But how could I know anything? I could only conjecture, for Ngaraki said no word, and I could not read the strange characters engraven on the granite breast of this 12th Tohunga. From the chief's attitude it was evident that this image perplexed him sorely. Was it that he detected some resemblance of its face to his own, or was he communing in spirit with the ancient being who had set his image there with such ideal meaning? I could not tell, for he was silent, and when at last he turned, torch in hand, and, holding his arms up towards some vision he seemed to see above the darkness, chanted some words that were full of tenderness and yearning. It was in the ancient priestly language which few even of the Ariki can understand. It was an unknown tongue to me, but I recognized it from its likeness to some of the more ancient karakias or mystic hymns I had often heard repeated as charms by the lesser Tohungas. But the meaning of Ngaraki's gestures, and the soft inflections of his voice showed plainly that he was addressing Hinori as from the breast of the 12th Tohunga standing in the darkness of the abyss. His cursing mood had fallen from him like a garment, and in my heart I felt drawn towards this strange savage, yet I knew that any profane person found trespassing within the precincts of his sacred temple would find small mercy at his hands, and therefore I took good care to keep out of his way. I knew that if my presence was discovered I should be taken for one of those visitors mentioned by Tamakawawa as certain men who had the fire of the vile Tohungas in their eyes. I should be accused of planning the destruction of Hinori, and then my head would be taken and hung up in the abyss. Ngaraki now turned in his ancient chant with a sudden quickening of his words, and, as most men do when a thing appeals to them in a new and surprising light, spoke in the tongue which came more fluent to him. See. The city is silent. He appeared to be interpreting the ancient characters on the breast of the 12th Tohunga. The great queen sleeps above the darkness. My fellow seers have withdrawn into the sky, and I, Zun, with these vile brethren of Hua, am all that is left of the people of the south. Mine is the task. Yes, Ngaraki seemed to speak these words, which had been graven on the breast of the image, as if they stated exactly his own case. Mine is the task to watch over the tapu of the Bright One, and to this end I have cast myself down to consort with the vile, to know them, to know their names, to understand that of which they are the embodiment. And I record that I know what I do, and none shall say that I fell through weakness. It is done. The city is silent. The great queen sleeps above the darkness, but she sleeps in safety, for I have confounded the vile ones with their own magic. Lo, I have delivered a gross image into their hands to bind down and oppress, and now in scorn I turn my back upon them and gaze up towards the future of the world. They will return, and I shall return, and in the far future Hia will arise and hurl their gross image of woman upon their heads. Then shall I conquer and triumph over the vile ones and cast their lord into the pit that yawns before me. And through the everlasting night I wait for Hia, praying that life shall be long and death short, praying that the rival of the dawn will obtain for man a life that ever rises again from the darkness. He paused and seemed lost in thought. He had evidently read the words in a new light. Then, as if seeking more of this new light from a familiar thing, he passed to the back of the image and held his torch up again till the rays fell upon the strange characters there also engraven. As one who reconsiders what has long puzzled him, he read: We, the brotherhood of Hua, laugh and scorn at the windy words of Zun. He sees a phantom up there in the darkness. Hia is swallowed up in Hua, whose body we have bound down to the rock forever. Her spirit we have bound also to the moon face, that we may see to work our will. By her bondage we shall live, but the life of Hia's people shall be short and their death long. They shall die and become like soil, and those they leave behind them shall weep and wail and lament. Therefore we laugh and scorn at the windy words of Zun. We shall live and rule the world while our images endure. Ngaraki remained silent a space. Then the last I saw of him for many weeks was characteristic of the man. He slowly approached the brink of the abyss below the abyss, and stood for a moment gazing down. In a second his sudden blood boiled over with a return of his former fierceness and, pointing downwards with outstretched arm, while he turned his head towards the chief of the vile ones, he yelled, "Anga! Destroyers of the woman! My enemies of the ancient night! That is the way by which your heads go down to the pot." A moment the torch was held aloft, then, with a fierce gesture, he flung it into the depths below, and all was dark again, save for the patch of moonlight, which had now retreated far along the level floor. I said this was the last I saw of Muraki, and that is quite true, for though I came into close contact with him that very night, and felt more of his strength than I have any desire to feel again, it was all transacted in the darkness of that terrible place.